so I like to get started right on time. Thanks so much for attending today. I'm Rebecca Vandevoort, Special Assistant to the Provost and Associate Director for Academic Outreach and Innovation. And we are pleased to Academic Outreach and Innovation, the Provost's Office, and the Teaching Academy co-sponsor these series of faculty-led workshops. We're really pleased today to have Dr. Bill Condon with us speaking about rubrics. Bill's been on the WSU campus almost 20 years. He was at one time director of writing programs and has done that job at a number of other universities as well, and is co-author of Writing on the Information Superhighway.
Writing the information.
Writing the information superhighway. Okay. So
writing on is graffiti.
Oh, okay. Sorry. All right. So I will put this in Bill's hands. We do have several people attending via the live stream, and so they can't hear you unless you're talking into a mic. So when we get to questions, if you could wait for someone to bring you a mic, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I was told that people normally stand, so if I get in your way and you can't see what I'm saying, let me know. The idea of a rubric goes back at least into Roman times. Originated probably in a red earth-derived dye that was used to mark a sheep that was ready to be shorn. That's a little symbolic sometimes in the way that we see rubrics being used in classrooms as tools to help us simply judge the work of students, whatever they're learning, in whatever form they give it to us. I want to play with that today and think about how to get more bang for our buck, basically. How do we use the convenience of a rubric, the many good features of a rubric, while avoiding the negative ones and actually helping generate student learning? So one of the things I want us to think about, and this is a term I've used in my own research, the notion of a generative assessment. So a generative assessment is one that we make that actually increases student learning. It doesn't just label for them how much they've learned or give them a message that they're passing or failing or middling, but it actually is a form of assessment that increases their learning. There's a tension there because generative assignments and assessments tend to demand more time. And time is a precious commodity, especially as class sizes increase. So we want to kind of play with that tension as we go. But if you look at this is from an article I wrote about generative assessments. It's kind of the top of a three-part chart. It's the good part. You don't want to see the other parts. But this is about assessments that tend to be more individualized, that tend to be descriptive, that are really centered in learning outcomes, that are active, that is engaged with the curriculum we're trying to convey, that are probably more richly descriptive than a number or a letter. Okay, so we're looking at how to deliver that kind of bang without increasing the amount of time that we have to spend doing it. So, generative assessments tend to be the kind of assessment where you don't say to a student, let's stop learning now and take a test. Okay? They're the kinds of assessments where you say, let's continue learning as we see how you're doing. Okay? They're very much centered in the local context, whether it's the classroom, the curriculum. They're at least as much concerned with identifying what's going right for a student as they are for what's going wrong. Okay? So the traditional rubric sort of says, well, you're not doing this very well. This rubric also says, these are some things you are doing really well. Okay? So that kind of granularity is important. These rubrics tend to be active in the learning process. So they're tools that you would use as students begin a performance, let's say, as they maybe peer review each other or self-assess along the way. And certainly then tools that you would use at the end to give them a grade, a score or a grade. And what we're trying to do here is kind of engage, rather than, as I said before, let's keep on learning. Don't stop learning and take a test. Well, don't stop teaching and give a test either. Okay, so let's see about how we can engage those two things together. So let's think about what rubrics do. We want to think about what we value. Okay. What are students doing? What do we value in what they're doing? Those are what the grading dimensions are centered on. Okay, and that's defined by the course. It may be defined by the level of student. It's certainly defined by the discipline and the role of the course in the curriculum. Good rubrics will describe whatever it is you're trying to grade in its best state. So when I'm looking at, for example, grading student writing, I want to know what that kind of writing would look like in its best state, and start from there. Okay, we don't want to encourage student writing that's not in its best state. So we really want to make sure that the rubric accommodates that best state. A good rubric also maps outcomes and it turns them into standards. So an outcome is something that says this is what students should know or be able to do when they leave my course. But there's nothing in an outcome that says how well. How well are they going to have to do it in order to leave my course? So that's what a good rubric does, is it translates those outcomes into standards. It also creates a language, shared language between us and our students, between our students and each other, to talk about quality. Students often miss what we mean when we think about quality. UW did a brilliant study several years back called Student Opinions of Undergraduate Learning. And one of the things they found was that incoming students believe that how hard they work and how much time they spent translate into quality. Professors think how much you know, how much you can do with what you know, what a high level of critical thinking is, those sorts of things translate into quality. So without a tool to help us meet, we pass each other in the night. We don't understand each other. And then providing transparency. Most grading for from a student standpoint happens in a black box. It seems often idiosyncratic. It seems Kafkaesque. I don't have any idea why I got a B this time and a C last time. I don't have any idea what the difference really is between a B and an A. So we want to take grading out of that black box and create a system where students can know why they are where they are, and then know how to get to a higher level. And a rubric can create language that helps students to do that. And then finally, let's face it, we're looking for grading efficiency. When I use a rubric, I can grade 50 papers and give rich feedback in the time that it takes to watch a Monday night football game. And, not just doing it during the commercials. So let's start for a minute with how not to do it, how not to do a rubric. This is an example of a very common rubric that if you have children in grade school or high school, you have seen probably before. It's the ubiquitous 6 traits rubric. It purports to be national. You'll find this rubric or a very close version of it posted in every state's website that has to do with testing students and setting standards for student writing. There are a number of things wrong with it, but the main thing that's wrong with it is it doesn't have anything to do with anybody's specific curriculum. If you're using this rubric, for example, to grade a lab assignment, there's really very little on here for you or the student to go by. If I'm using it in a composition class, one of the things I note is that organization and content of ideas are just 2. Okay? The rest of this, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, convention, all has to do with surface features. I might as well just be giving them a grammar test. So the farther away you get from the classroom, this is the point here, the farther away a rubric is from the actual classroom where it's being used, the least likely it is to be helpful either to you or your students. So that leaves us to create our own. And I'm going to look at three levels for doing that. One is our critical thinking guide. One is a process I use in upper division courses that aren't writing centered. And then one is from Honors 298, a writing course where the students and I actually collaboratively create the rubric. And you have handouts on all of these things. So the first example I want to talk about is our critical thinking guide, which was developed here in the late 90s, was the subject of a large FIPSI grant and a lot of faculty development from about 2000 to 2003, and which I was able to follow up on in some research from a grant with a grant from the Spencer Foundation over the last 3 years. And the good news is that when faculty learn to become better teachers, students become better learners. And once faculty learn to become better teachers, that learning continues. So one of the things we found with our critical thinking participants from 2000 to 2003, by 2009 and 10, they had not only retained those practices, but continued to innovate. You know, one of the things they got out of that development project was figuring out how to continue to make their process better, their teaching better, their pedagogy better. And that translates into student learning. So we've got a guide that was derived from faculty values about critical thinking. I won't go into the detail in the development process, but it really happened as a result of a lot of conversations around campus and around the country and even around the world about what faculty value in critical thinking. It was not developed to be used as is. So the version you have in your handout is what I like to call the rubric. You know, it's kind of the original, but you have to develop that. You have to adapt that. Your students as freshmen may not be able to do all this. Your graduate students may be way beyond the language in here, but you're still wanting them to do some of the things that this rubric does. So you have to adapt it. And you have some of the adaptations there in your handout. From physics, from entomology, from a philosophy course, and I'll leave you to look at those. But basically, picking and choosing, translating the language into the language of your discipline, translating it into a level, into a relative scale so that you're grading freshmen on a scale that's appropriate for freshmen and seniors on a scale that's appropriate for seniors. Those are all important parts of adaptation. But what you ask yourself basically with a tool like this is, how does this look in my discipline? How would I describe it to students in my discipline? And that then becomes the rubric. We want to incorporate this then into the learning process by handing it to students, first of all. If you've created a rubric for them, as you would with this tool, then hand it out with the syllabus. This is how I grade. You know, these are the standards. This is what counts. And then incorporate it into peer review, tutoring sessions. Obviously use the language to talk about good performance in your class. Use the language in responding to students when you respond on their assignments. In that way, the rubric becomes a tool for communication between you and your students, between your students and each other, and everything kind of gets its level raised. Students in the end, and I think this was telling, one of my students said that with the opportunity to do revisions with the rubric, they could figure out how to make the numbers move, by which they meant how to get a higher score next time. Okay. So you engage that with them. Now, second example. The second example is the English 360 rubric, which is a scoring guide for a course called Rhetorics, Ancient and Modern. It's and I use it to grade their papers. They have 4 papers in the term. This course runs from roughly Plato and the Sophists all the way up to Kenneth Burke and the modern rhetoricians. It's like the Platte River. It's a mile wide and an inch deep. So what I asked them to do is, during their first peer review of their first assignment, describe the strengths in each other's essays, in each other's drafts. Okay, so a draft is due, say, on Tuesday. The final version will be due a week later. They come in with their drafts and they identify strengths. I take those strengths then and convert those into a rubric. And you have that rubric in front of you. You also have behind it the list of strengths that it came from. And you can see that these are graded in the kind of term, or grounded in the kind of terminology that a rhetoric course would require. So I talk about invention, ethos, logos, pathos, talk about arrangement, Those kinds of, that terminology becomes something we share as they learn about and then perform oral and written rhetoric. I also recognize that this is a course that's sitting in a curriculum. And so my course is responsive. My rubric has to be responsive to the courses that students have come from and the ones that they're bound for. You know, so the principles I'm teaching, the behaviors I'm encouraging, have to prepare them well for 460, for example, for the senior level course. In terms of writing, in terms of any performance, really, every class is a community of, in my case, writers. And we have a set of standards. We have a description somewhere in our heads of what good writing means. The rubric process, the process of development, helps us to get those standards out of our heads and onto paper, and to share them and arrive at a better expression of them. The rubric then, if I'm developing it from scratch, it will change a little bit with each paper. Because as they peer review each paper, they're feeding me strengths that aren't on the rubric yet. And I'm revising the rubric to fit that. Okay? So that emergent rubric in that case, they become part of the process of creating it, but it's not a writing-centered course. This is more like an M course, writing in the major course. So, you know, as I'm working with them, I'm still really in charge of that. I don't want to take the time out to do that rubric creation process with them, but I'm getting their feedback, or their feed forward, if you will, in order to create the rubric myself, because I know how to do that, you know. And then, you know, what happens with that is that as students see that they have they have input into the process, they buy into it, they invest in it, they engage with it more. They understand where all that comes from. They see their perception of what makes good writing translated into a rubric that encourages them to do good writing, and used in their peer review and in their self-assessments in order to create a sense of where that goes. So that's kind of the second example. The third one is what I like to think of as full tilt boogie. Okay? If you really want to go out there and you're teaching a class that either is or you can make writing centered. Okay, this would work in a writing in the major course where there were several assignments along the term, which is the way writing in the major courses are supposed to work. Wouldn't work too well in a class where there's a large paper due in the last week of class and that's it. Okay, so if you're teaching a writing in the major course, you have opportunities early for students to perform and get feedback. You have opportunities to revise. You have several other assignments, not just one or two. So this kind of process could work in that if you wanted to adopt it. Like I said, with my M course, 360, one of them, I use the process I just described as the kind of the middle ground. But here's how it looks like when you just do it all. Okay, again, students bring in a draft middle of the second week of the term. Okay. They peer review that draft and they give me a list of strengths. A list of strengths. That list of strengths is back there. Every time they do a peer review, one of the responsibilities for each pair or each group is to give me a list of the strengths that they see in each other's papers. What we're trying to arrive at is, what's the best? You know, how do we create the best writing, you know, that we're capable of? These are mostly freshmen in English 298, so we're looking at freshman writing. That's different from senior level writing. So we're not looking at E.B. White or John Irving or anything like that. We're looking for the best that these freshman students in the Honors College can do. Eventually, after the second or third round, it's clear that those strengths are beginning to fall into categories. You know, so one class might have a category about introductions. And, usually there's a category that's about kind of raising a question at least, and then there's a category about conclusions, probably categories about evidence, about organization. Every class is a little different, you know, but they cover roughly the same landscape. Those categories, you get about 8 or 9 of them is plenty. Those categories then turn into the dimensions that I'm grading. Eventually then, by midterm, as we develop, students are using those lists as things to encourage each other to do in their writing. We haven't yet turned them into standards. Okay, we haven't developed criteria, descriptors of criteria yet. But this is the first half of the term. Okay? But they're using those lists to encourage those behaviors in each other. Add strengths as drafts progress. New genres enter the mix. We talk about everything from the honors colleges, student learning outcomes, to the goals for the baccalaureate, the rubric that the honors college uses ultimately to grade honors theses. All those things affect the critical thinking guide, which is a general expectation of faculty here. All these things feed into their understanding of what does the institution expect of me, and how does that work into the criteria that we're slowly developing. Finally, about midterm, the students actually then turn those lists into sentences that describe good writing. So they're steeped in it by this time. They've been observing each other. They've been looking at all kinds of things. So they turn those criteria into sentences, the sentences that you see filling the mastering category. Really, when you think about assessing student work, Peter Elbow would argue, we only need 3 grades. We only need 3 outcomes. We need not good enough, praiseworthy. Okay? Now you'll see that on my rubrics I choose to divide those 3 categories each in half. So you can get low good enough or high good enough. But it gives me a 6-point scale, and that gives me the numbers to separate students out and to sort of fit the profile of the grades, the letter grades I ultimately have to give them. Again, the focus is on good writing. We start with that, and we kind of subtract. Okay, so here's what you really want to do. What's enough? How do we change that so that it's good enough? And then, what's not good enough? How do we subtract enough from that to make it really, really bad? Then you provide multiple opportunities for students to use the peer review in self-reflection. You'll see one of the handouts I love the best is I break up every sentence in the mastering category. I break it up into single sentences and put a Likert scale on it, and they have to review each other's papers and mark each sentence. From strongly agree to strongly disagree. It gives a rich set of feedback in a very short amount of time. So you can be, once you've got this thing and you and your students are in it together, you can be pretty creative with it. Okay, let's sum up. These things work best in environments where the assessments are richer. So if you have a course in which you can use a portfolio of work as a means of giving a grade, that's a much richer, in a number of ways, a much richer tool than going assignment by assignment by assignment. If they have a chance to revise before the end. So for example, in another M course I teach, Language, Text, and Technology, which is a digital technology and culture course, 375, students revise, they present work during the term, they revise it for their portfolio. That's just one revision, but that portfolio is their final. So I'm not giving a separate final exam or anything, but they get a chance to improve the work they've already done for that. And that gives them a sense of really, writers will tell you that 90% of writing happens in revision. So it gives us a chance to bring revision into play. It gives us a chance to bring feedback into play, self-evaluation into play, reflective practices, delayed grading. If you can put that off, the 298 students, they don't get a grade. English 101 students don't get a grade until the end. They're working toward a grade the whole time, obviously, but you want to take the focus off of that. You want to help them have a getting better mindset, an improvement mindset, rather than a being good mindset. You want to encourage further work. This kind of practice promotes a real rich feedback experience in the class. They're getting a lot of information from each other. They get some information from me. You'd be surprised how much just circling those numbers on the rubric, how much feedback that gives to students, because those descriptors amount to a rich description of writing at 6 levels, really, and a rich description of how to get writing to another level. So basically, it kind of trains students as autodidacts, shall we say, assessors, and it also trains them in sense in being de facto tutors. They know how to get there. They try to get there. Over time, they get there, and they help each other. So those are the things we want to think about. And then finally, the results. A number of things happen when a rubric process is working well. One of those things is when you engage the assessment tool with the learning, then students invest. You take away the mystery, they invest in earning a higher grade because they can see how to get there. They internalize. They become more instinctively aware of the things that we already know. We know how to write well in our disciplines. We know that. We've acquired it over a lot of years. And we've become so good at it, we've forgotten how to communicate it. So students learn it. It seems fairer, more transparent to students. They can track their own progress over time, making the numbers move. It really does promote, especially in a writing class or even an M course where there's revision involved, it promotes much higher achievement. Students will get, because the rubric offers a form of scaffolding, they will get higher grades, but they will earn those. Those are not the kinds of grades that we worry about when we think about grade inflation. Those are the kinds of grades we applaud because we have actually scaffolded their process and helped them see how to get there in a genuine sort of way. It helps to de-emphasize grades. One of the things that you will find the first time you use a rubric is that it freaks the students out. They're used to a grading scale that nominally goes from 0 to 100, but really starts at 60 or 67 or wherever you start it, okay? A rubric starts at 0 or 1. They can get half the points on the rubric and be doing B work, okay? So it'll freak them out a little bit. But what it helps to do is it uncouples progress toward real achievement from a grade. Because it really depends on how the numbers translate at the end of the term as to what their actual grade is. But they can tell because if they're getting 5s and 6s, they're in good shape. They can get there. And then a much higher level of student satisfaction. I can tell you that in doing course evaluations that are narrative in nature, my students are most approving of the practice around the rubric. That it helped them understand where their grades were coming from, that they knew where they stood as they went along, and they knew what the next steps were, and they felt that it was really fair, that I wasn't hiding anything from them or tricking them in any way through my grading. So that's basically what I wanted to lay out there, and we can go ahead and talk about things from here.
Questions, comments?
I know that's a lot. I talked fast.
Is anybody in the room currently using rubrics?
No, that was just exactly what I was going to ask. Anybody using a rubric? Okay, so how does all this strike you?
I use it mostly for grading purposes, and I'm just starting with them, and so mostly it's because I haven't had a chance to develop them before I need to grade them that I don't turn them out to the students yet, but right. I would like to in the future. I have seen some arguments and pretty well rebutted that it can stifle creativity when the students know exactly what they have to do, and so that turns assignments into more of a cookie cutter.
And I think that's the problem with things like that 6 traits rubric. They focus on such really sort of minutia that students feel like it's a recipe to follow. You know, whereas if you look at these dimensions, this is much more fluid. Whether it's the critical thinking guide or the full tilt boogie version, it's much more fluid, and they have to get in there and grapple with it. So what course do you teach?
Introduction to Geographic Information Systems.
Wonderful. Okay.
And also remote sensing.
Okay. Cool. So what kinds of outcomes are you looking for?
One of the tracks is teaching students how to communicate with maps. And in a way, it's or I tell them at the beginning, just like when they learned to write, they didn't start with Shakespeare. When they start to make maps, they don't start with National Geographic. And so we're trying. It's an experience learning to communicate with symbols. It's fun, and they usually enjoy it.
Yeah, and it's a great example of a graphic but non-writing kind of thing where you're looking at how to translate something that you can identify what's a good one and what's not, and the steps in between. And students are usually starting from not knowing very much, not being able to do that very well, to being able to do it better. So in effect, it's the same. It's the same process. What's that construct look like? How do you describe it in its best form? Then what's good enough? What would you want students to at least reach a level of competence? And then what's not good enough? You don't want to send somebody out of the course who can't do it well enough. So as long as you can define those levels of performance, no matter what the subject is, whether it's writing, whether it's a lab report in a science course, or a map, a visual process. I use the critical thinking guide in the DTC 375 course, and I'm evaluating podcasts and websites, and it's one of the values of it is that it does have a category on there for effective communication, but it doesn't depend. The thinking part doesn't depend on genre. Now, for a lot of you probably want to, if you're teaching in a science course, for example, and not liking the writing you get, a big reason of that is probably that your students aren't really adept yet at the genres that you're asking them to write in. They don't know. Good writing in an English course is very different from good writing in an engineering course. In fact, a lot of good writing in an engineering course contains a lot of stuff that an English course wouldn't recognize as writing, but it is writing in engineering. So you really, students have to learn the content that they need to learn, but they also need to learn how people think and write, how people think and communicate in your discipline. And you can help them with that by including that in the rubric. So that genre, that map genre, is a fascinating genre to work with. Yeah.
I use the rubric in my class in a peer assessment context where the students are giving each other feedback on an oral, a very brief, relatively informal, but an oral presentation that they do with each other. And I developed the rubric myself, thinking ahead of time, well, what are the things that I think would be good or not so good? But I was really intrigued by the way you have the students generate a rubric for their own class. And I was wondering if you can kind of just walk us through what the mechanics of that are in a given class session. How do you actually get them to put those qualities out there that they're identifying as strengths of each other's work?
So what courses would you be thinking about in doing
Well,
that?
I teach in the vet school, so I teach one of the gross anatomy courses, and we have to teach in sections, and so I have one student from the early section stay for a few extra minutes while the second group comes in, and they each give a little overview of what the material was that day to the incoming group. And this happens,
Nice.
4 days a week, and so any given student does it 6 to 8 times over the course of the semester. So in my head anyway, what's happening is that they're getting feedback over the course of the semester where they should be getting more comfortable with the vocabulary and having a better sense of how to organize this 10-minute presentation, which it's sort of borne out in the data if you look at that longitudinally. But again, it was all descriptors that I came up with a priori, right? This is what I was thinking about heading. But I really like the idea of having the students participate in the process of generating the rubric, because, as you said, it should generate buy-in, but I think it also gets them thinking about what they're trying to accomplish in a little bit deeper level. So I was just really just trying to visualize how do you use like half a class session for that, or is it a whole class session, or how does that work?
Well, I think you could do that pretty quickly. I mean, again, depending on whether you want them, if you want them to actually develop the rubric. I mean, I sort of tell them the writing-centered courses in the last week of the class. Now, you guys have to train me on how to use this rubric, because I haven't used it yet. They've been using it on each other's work. But what you're working with is a balance of what you know versus what you can get from them. So, like, I know how to make a rubric. They then give me the content for the rubric. So in the situation you described, one of the things you might do is ask the students in each class, what was there about that beginning presentation that helped them, that was useful for them, or that they really valued? And then that would become, because what you're trying to do is to kind of think about that construct and what it is in its best state. So if they, so I don't know how many iterations of that, but 4, 5, 6 through the day or through the week, you'd have a lot of characteristics, and a lot of them would be repeated, which is good, because it would be kind of consensus that when those people do certain things, it makes it easier for the students that are listening to them to understand. And then you hand that back to the ones doing the presenting and say, these are the things you want to shoot for. So it in that way it cycles through, and then as you go along and they get better at it, you keep asking those questions, keep making that rubric, understanding what that best state is, and then you can always develop the good enough and the not good enough once you know what the best state is. What we find in a lot of rubric practice, the 6 traits is an example of that, is people start with the bad. They start with fail. And then they just kind of add little things here and there till you get up to what they feel like should be an A. Well, let's focus students on what we really want them to do. Focus on the A first, and then we can cope with the fallout as students are not getting there. They can also understand what just good enough is or not good enough. Does that help, or does that answer your question? Okay.
I'm just curious how much, if at all, you model early rubrics for your students. Do you give them examples, or do you just tell them based on your own experience, come up with the strengths for the assignment? I ask in part because I'm teaching classes which sometimes introduce new genres, like the Rogerian model of argument, which a lot of people have not looked at before, and so they may not know what the strengths of that genre look like. So I'm just curious how much early on you model, or do you just turn them loose and build off that?
I always have, every now and then I vary from it, but I always have this kind of format in mind. That I'm going to come up with dimensions, that I'm going to use a 6 or sometimes an 8-point scale, 7, something. The scale can vary, but that I'm going to have then boxes in here that describe different levels. Okay. From that point, no, I don't, because I'm not teaching a particular form of argument, for example. I don't do that. But I would expect that as they learn from you more about what Rogerian argument is, that's kind of one of those things that where I say we respond to the community around us. So that terminology would work its way into the strengths that they're giving to you, and then you would work that into the rubric. You might want to use a process kind of like the English 360, where you kind of already know what terminology you want in the dimensions for good performance. And you can infuse that as you go along. But I think it's really important that a lot of what the students give you stays in that rubric. They need to recognize, when they fed you a list of strengths, they need to recognize that you valued that, that it's there. It can get modified. I mean, I'm going to be completely open and say that, I shape that rubric. I'm the one that has, in this case, the assessment expertise to really make that rubric work, to make sure that the dimensions are separate and distinct from each other, to make sure that we have the right number of them. I will coach them, for example, if they have sort of two categories that might become one, or one that needs to become two, I'll coach them in that direction. But their work, their ideas remain very visible in that rubric. I try, when they turn those categories into statements, into sentences, I try to stay as close as I can to their sentences until they want me to revise it. Again, in a writing course, there are lots of cycles of feedback and revision. In a writing in the major course, there are not as many. So I take advantage of the writing course because they're always, every week, they're telling me something more about that rubric. Whereas with the writing in the major course, it's maybe 3 or 4, on the outside 5 times, they're giving me feedback about the rubric. So in that kind of course, an upper division course where I'm using writing to support learning, not teaching writing, I'm really kind of more in charge of the rubric at that point than they are, but I'm still asking them to identify the strengths and to use what they know of the course content to do that.
I see this, I can understand it in terms of writing courses and those things, but the 4 of us that are sitting here are either faculty or graduate students. We teach a Human Development 101 class that the size ranges from 80 to 125 students, and they do a weekly writing. And so, we
Good
go
for you.
kind of well, we'll see.
Yeah, I'm applauding you though. I'm applauding I'm applauding the ambition.
Yeah. Thank goodness for really good graduate students and undergrad TAs that we can train to help with grading. But trying to do, it would come up with doing a separate rubric almost for each of 14 or 15 writing assignments. They're short. They're, 10 points, but they also incorporate an in-class piece for partial points and then an actual writing piece that goes with it. And so trying to think about, how can we do this to be more efficient with this? We literally go womb to tomb in 15 weeks. So we cover from prenatal development up to death. And so trying to use the same rubric for each of the assignments isn't very feasible.
You might look, without knowing more about about the assignments, there are 2 places to work there. One is to make the assignments more comparable in terms of the process and in terms of kind of the final goals of the assignments all taken together. So if you could think about homogenizing that a little bit, that would make it less this and then that and then that, and more of a growth. Sure, and more of a here we are, we're growing as we go. Okay, but take a look at this philosophy rubric that's in your packet behind the critical thinking guide. And this was as much for a face-to-face conversation as a grading rubric, but it's really about formative feedback. Now you could put numbers onto this, but you can see the questions he's asking, and basically he's saying, are you headed in the wrong direction? Are you headed in the right direction? Are you in a good place? As kind of the feedback there. So I would think in maybe in these terms where you simplify, in a sense, you're simplifying what you're grading, and if you've got a sense in which they're growing from one assignment to the next, so each one builds on what they've got before, then each time they can see how they've improved their performance, and they can have some feedback about how to make the next performance better. And that kind of thing, I would think, would actually kind of tie everything together in ways that would allow them to see that. Because when I look at what I preferred as a student and what my students talk about, when it's just do this and move on to this and then move on to this and there's no inherent connection, they resist that. Or frankly, they give a lot less attention to the learning when that's the case. Because it seems, as you put it, it seems disjointed, much more likely to seem like it's all happening in a black box. So giving them something that allows them to see how each one is connected and has at least common elements of a scale. It wouldn't have to be the same scale literally each time, because there are, I'm sure in each of those 14 or 15 assignments, there's a content objective that changes, birth to death. So that part of it could change, while the process parts, how are you thinking about this? What are you doing with this? Those kinds of things. Those process parts could kind of stay the same. I think that might streamline your process and make it a little more informative for the students. But I sort of set out. I used to teach world civilizations when it was in the curriculum in Gen Ed, and I did it. I took it on expressly so that I could have a large class. Now it's not as large as HD, but it was 50, and that's twice as many at least as I get in a writing course. So I wanted to try some of these ideas out, and my practice with rubrics has been, in one sense, how lazy can I be? How little can I be? Can I be in charge of the student's learning process? How much can I put on them? And in the last 6 or 8 years, doing this rubric development, I've sort of reached what I think is the limit there. It goes so far as even to turn grading over to them in a very real sense. I mean, I'm the one that puts the numbers on their portfolios at the end. But they've developed the means that I have to use to do that, and I'm bound by the language of that rubric. So if I haven't guided that process adequately, then somebody wins or somebody loses because the descriptions aren't adequate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Condon. With quantitative measures, we actually have this validation pipeline to go through to validate a measure or a test. I want to know with qualitative measures like a rubric, is there any validation check or objective data you obtain to further gain evidence on the validity of the rubric you're using, or it's just a qualitative way of seeing things?
That's a great question, because what we're trying to do with a rubric is turn a qualitative description into a quantitative product, into a number, that results in a grade. Part of what I do is research in large-scale writing assessment, so I'm, like you, I'm familiar with those numbers and the ideas of validation and reliability and those sorts of things. At the same time, I'm working with n's that are very small, 20, 25. So they don't lend themselves to actually running the statistics, but since I know kind of what that looks like, I can tell if the rubric is off. I can tell if the numbers are off. And I have to say, if you know how to build the rubric, that is, you've got the categories matter, they're distinct from one another, the descriptors allow you to identify a 4 from a 5 in particular. If those things are working, and that's part of my craft with the rubric, then the numbers come out very well. And one thing I will say that I usually do is I do give a few examples to a colleague and ask them just to read and score according to the rubric. And not a lot, because that's pretty time intensive. If they haven't internalized the rubric, it takes a lot of time. The first couple of papers it take a while to grade. After that, it doesn't. But their grades are usually within 2 points, total points of mine. So I do some of I think it's important to do some of those practices to make sure we're being fair to students. But I think the thing I've noticed in doing this is that the difference between having a rubric and having the students generate the rubric is that the grades are higher, the performances are higher with the class-generated rubric. They know how to do well, when they've figured that out for themselves, rather than just having me tell them, no matter how good a job I do in telling them.
Well, it looks like we are out of time, so thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for Dr. Condon?
Oh, come on, can we have a standing ovation? No.
And
Thank you all. Those were great questions.
I always like to thank the AOI crew for putting this on. It takes a lot of behind-the-scenes work, so thank you very much. This is our second in a series of 10 faculty-led workshops that will be happening this year. So the next one is October 29th. Sheila Converse will talk about, Sheila D. Posey and David Macon, all three of them, will talk about motivating students to come to class prepared. So I think that should be a really good one. It will be in the room next door. And again, we will be serving snacks to help tide you over the lunch hour. So thank you very much for coming. Thanks, Dr. Condon, for presenting.